Something shifted in Cleveland, and it didn't happen on the field. For months, the conversation around the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation sounded like the usual chaos. Draft speculation, hot takes, fans arguing in circles about who should start and who should be gone. But behind all that noise, a much quieter story was unfolding. One that suggests the Browns may have already made a decision most people weren't ready to see coming. Because when it comes to quarterbacks, teams usually show their hand in obvious ways. They panic, they reach, they overcorrect. Cleveland didn't do any of that. Instead, they made moves that felt deliberate, almost restrained. And that restraint has people inside and outside the league asking the same question: why now? That's where Shedeur Sanders enters the picture. Not as a headline-grabbing announcement, not as a declaration, but as a name that keeps resurfacing in conversations that matter: ownership discussions, coaching interviews, and long-term planning. And when ownership starts paying attention, everything changes. Especially when that ownership belongs to Jimmy Haslam. Reports and media chatter suggest this isn't just about talent anymore. It's about stability, direction, and avoiding another full reset that could set the franchise back years. Nothing has been officially announced. Nothing has been guaranteed. But the signs are there, and they're getting harder to ignore. Because when a team stops acting desperate, it usually means they believe they already have something. And once you connect the dots, the Browns' next move doesn't look risky at all. It looks intentional. While most fans were locked into mock drafts and quarterback debates, the Browns were telling a very different story without saying a word. Look closely at how the offseason unfolded. No desperate trade-up, no public flirtation with the next shiny QB prospect. No, we're starting from scratch energy. Instead, the Cleveland Browns doubled down on everything around the quarterback position: defense, physicality, skilled players who can produce immediately, moves designed to support a quarterback, not replace one. That matters more than people realize. Teams that don't believe in their QB room act loudly. They leak interest, they posture, they manufacture urgency. Cleveland didn't. Their draft priorities sent a subtle message: we're building a foundation, not hunting for a savior. And that's usually the first sign an organization thinks it already has something worth developing. That's where Shedeur Sanders comes back into focus. There was no press conference declaring him the future, no headline-grabbing endorsement, but internally the moves lined up: protect the defense, add playmakers, avoid the financial and cultural cost of another QB reset. That's not accidental, it's calculated. And consider the timing. This comes after years of instability at the position, years of cycling through hope, disappointment, and forced optimism. Ownership knows the cost of that better than anyone. Another restart doesn't just burn cap space, it fractures trust. With the locker room, with the fan base, with the city. So when Cleveland chose patience over panic, it raised eyebrows. Especially because the league has seen this pattern before. When teams believe a young quarterback can grow, they stop chasing replacements and start creating an environment. They invest quietly. They shift the conversation without ever announcing it. And by the time the public realizes what's happening, the decision has already been made. Is that exactly what's happening here? No one has confirmed it. Reports suggest, insiders speculate, but the strategy points in one direction. And once you notice it, it's hard to ignore. Because the Browns didn't just pass on chaos, they avoided it. And that choice alone says more than any headline ever could. And the deeper you dig, the clearer the intent becomes, especially when you look at who the Browns are talking to next. If there's one person whose mindset ultimately decides where this franchise goes next, it's Jimmy Haslam. And lately, the signs point to a noticeable change in how he's approaching the quarterback question. Haslam has lived through every version of the Browns' QB cycle: the splashy moves, the public optimism, The resets that were supposed to fix everything and didn't. Each one came with massive expectations and even bigger consequences. Financial strain, locker room fatigue, fan burnout, and that history matters now more than ever. Because ownership doesn't just think in seasons, it thinks in timelines. Reports and league chatter suggest Haslam is no longer interested in another dramatic reboot, not because he's scared to make moves, but because he understands the cost of making the wrong one. Resetting at quarterback isn't just about drafting someone new. It means reshaping the offense, realigning the coaching staff, and reintroducing uncertainty into a locker room that's already been through too much of it. That's why the focus has quietly shifted toward continuity. Instead of chasing the next headline, Haslam appears more concerned with finding stability that can carry through the next coaching era. And that's where Shedeur Sanders fits into the picture. Not as a finished product, but as a controllable, developmental option who doesn't require tearing everything down to the studs. This isn't being framed publicly as a commitment. It's being treated as an evaluation. But make no mistake, ownership evaluations carry weight. When Haslam is involved in quarterback discussions at this level, it signals that the decision isn't being left solely to coaches or scouts. It's strategic. And then there's the financial reality no one likes talking about. Another high-profile QB move would mean more guarantees, more pressure, and more margin for error disappearing overnight. Keeping a younger option in place buys time. It buys flexibility, and it allows the next head coach to walk into a situation that isn't already boxed in by a single do-or-die decision. Nothing here is official. Nothing has been announced. But insiders have hinted that Haslam wants a quarterback plan that survives beyond one season, one that doesn't depend on instant results or public approval. And once ownership starts thinking long-term, the franchise usually follows. Which explains why the next phase of this story doesn't start with a player at all, but with the people being interviewed to lead the team. This is where the story quietly took a turn that most fans didn't notice at first. As the Browns moved deeper into their head coaching search, reports began surfacing about what candidates were actually being asked behind closed doors. And while schemes, leadership style, and culture always come up, one topic kept surfacing more than expected: the quarterback room. Not in a vague, hypothetical way, but very specifically. According to league chatter, coaching candidates were being asked how they viewed Shedeur Sanders and whether they believed they could develop him. That detail matters a lot, because teams that are undecided at quarterback usually ask a different question. They ask who you want to bring in. They ask how you'd evaluate draft prospects. They ask how fast you can implement your own system. Cleveland didn't lead with that. Instead, they framed the discussion around what already exists. That alone suggests direction. When ownership and the front office center interviews around developing a specific quarterback, it signals that they're not looking for a coach to blow everything up. They're looking for alignment. Someone who sees the same runway they do, or at least understands why it matters. And that changes the power dynamic of the hire. Rather than handing a new coach a blank slate, the Browns appear to be offering a foundation, a strong defense, young skilled players, and a quarterback they believe is worth investing time into. That doesn't mean the coach has no say, but it does mean the organization isn't starting from zero again. That's a subtle but critical distinction. It also explains why some names feel more realistic than others. Coaches known for development, adaptability, and patience suddenly make more sense. Coaches who demand full control and instant results, less so. The Browns don't appear to be searching for a savior, they're searching for a builder. And that's where speculation starts to grow. Fans have begun wondering whether this approach effectively narrows the field, whether candidates who aren't sold on Sanders quietly remove themselves, whether those who see potential move higher on the list. Nothing confirmed, nothing leaked directly, but the logic tracks. Because if the Browns were truly undecided at quarterback, they wouldn't anchor interviews around one name. They would keep things open-ended. Instead, everything points toward a plan that includes continuity at the most volatile position in football. A plan designed to avoid another whiplash reset. A plan that puts development over desperation. And once you recognize that, the next layer of this story becomes even more interesting, especially when you look at how respected voices around the team are suddenly framing the Browns' future. When Mary Kay Cabot started making her media rounds, most people assumed it would be business as usual. Standard updates, careful phrasing, nothing that would move the needle. But buried inside her comments was a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed by those paying close attention. Instead of framing the Browns' job as a rebuild or a rescue mission, Cabot described it as attractive. That alone raised eyebrows. She pointed to the defense first, dominant, talented, and already in place. Then she mentioned roster strength, recent success, and a rookie class that outperformed expectations. What she didn't do was just as telling. She didn't describe Cleveland as desperate. She didn't frame the quarterback situation as a disaster. And she didn't suggest the next coach would be walking into chaos. That's not accidental language. Cabot has covered this team long enough to know how carefully words are chosen when things are uncertain. When reporters start emphasizing stability instead of urgency, it usually reflects what they're hearing internally. And in this case, the message felt clear. This isn't a franchise scrambling to save itself. It's one trying to manage what it already has. That framing matters when you get to the quarterback discussion. Cabot acknowledged that the Browns don't have a confirmed starter, but she made a point to mention Shedeur Sanders as part of the equation, not as an afterthought, not as a placeholder, just there, included, considered. And in NFL media, inclusion often signals belief. She also stressed that coaching candidates are being evaluated on fit, patience, and vision, not just splash. That suggests the organization is prioritizing alignment over star power. And alignment only works if everyone sees the roster the same way, especially at quarterback. Fans picked up on it immediately. The tone online shifted from "who are we drafting?" to "what if they already know?" Speculation grew. Nothing definitive, nothing confirmed, but enough smoke to make people pay attention. Because when respected insiders stop pushing urgency and start talking about runway, it usually means something behind the scenes has stabilized. Cabot didn't say Shedeur was the future. She didn't promise anything, but she didn't dismiss him either. And in a league where silence often speaks louder than declarations, that restraint carried weight, especially with everything else lining up around it. Because if the Browns were planning a hard reset, the messaging would look very different. And the fact that it doesn't suggest the organization may already be preparing for a future that most fans haven't fully processed yet. No matter how optimistic the framing gets, there's one part of this story the Browns can't avoid, and it's the most uncomfortable one. The quarterback room isn't just about potential, it's about timelines, money, and risk. And right now, all three are colliding. On paper, the presence of Deshaun Watson complicates everything. The contract, the expectations, the pressure to justify past decisions. But behind the scenes, reports and league buzz suggest Cleveland understands a hard truth. Uncertainty still exists, and pretending otherwise only delays the inevitable. That's why the Browns' recent behavior matters so much. Instead of tying the franchise's future to one outcome, they appear to be insulating themselves, building a roster that can compete without forcing a single quarterback narrative. And that's where the importance of a younger option like Shedeur Sanders becomes clearer. This isn't about replacing anyone overnight. It's about flexibility. Watson's situation both on and off the field has made long-term planning difficult. Not impossible, but fragile. One setback, one delay, one miscalculation, and the team is right back in scramble mode. Ownership knows that. The front office knows that, and that awareness shapes every decision they make. That's why developing a secondary path isn't optional, it's necessary. Keeping Sanders in the conversation gives Cleveland something it hasn't had in years, an alternative that doesn't require starting over. A quarterback who can be evaluated, coached, and potentially elevated without detonating the rest of the roster. And just as importantly, one who doesn't force an immediate financial or cultural commitment. Rumors suggest this is exactly why the Browns have avoided public declarations. They don't need to crown a future starter. They need options. And options buy leverage, with coaches, with the locker room, and with time. Fans may not like the ambiguity. Media may push for clarity. But inside the building, ambiguity can be a strategy. Because committing too early locks you in. Waiting keeps doors open. And in a league where quarterback mistakes can cost half a decade, that patience suddenly looks less like indecision and more like survival. Which brings the story to its most interesting turn yet. Because when you strip away contracts, speculation, and noise, one question remains. If Sanders wasn't part of the long-term picture, why does everything keep bending around him? Once you zoom out, the logic behind all of this becomes harder to dismiss. The Browns aren't chasing upside for the sake of headlines anymore. They're chasing alignment. And in that context, Shedeur Sanders checks boxes that matter far more internally than they do on debate shows. First, there's control. Sanders represents a quarterback option the Browns can evaluate without rushing a verdict. No massive guarantees. No immediate pressure to justify a blockbuster move. Just time, something this franchise has rarely allowed itself at the position. Time to coach, time to develop, time to see what's actually there. Then there's the locker room factor. One of the quiet risks of repeated QB resets is fatigue. Veterans get tired of learning new systems. Defenses get tired of carrying uncertainty. Leaders get tired of being asked to wait one more year. By keeping Sanders in the developmental pipeline, Cleveland avoids forcing another cultural reboot. It signals patience without surrendering competitiveness. And that message matters. From an organizational standpoint, Sanders also fits the timeline of the roster. The defense is ready now. The skilled players are ascending. The team doesn't need a quarterback who has to be protected from mistakes at all costs. They need one who can grow without destabilizing everything else. That's a narrower requirement than most fans realize, and it limits the pool dramatically. That's why speculation has grown that Sanders isn't being viewed as a gamble, but as a bridge with upside. Not a placeholder, not a publicity move, but a quarterback who allows the Browns to move forward without burning down what they've built. Reports haven't confirmed this directly, but insiders suggest the organization values how seamlessly he fits into multiple future scenarios. Starting, competing, developing, all without forcing a single irreversible decision. And then there's the coaching angle. A young quarterback with runway gives the next head coach something invaluable: flexibility, the ability to implement a system without forcing instant results, the chance to grow alongside the roster instead of being judged solely on year-one wins. For candidates looking to build, not survive, that's appealing. None of this guarantees Sanders becomes the long-term answer. That's important to say. Development isn't destiny, but what it does explain is why Cleveland's behavior keeps circling back to him, even without saying his name out loud. Because when a player fits financially, culturally, and strategically, teams don't need to announce their belief. They just act like it. And the Browns have been doing exactly that. This is the point where the conversation stops being about a quarterback and starts being about identity. For decades, the Cleveland Browns have been defined by instability at the most important position in sports. Different systems, different timelines, different answers that never quite worked. Each reset didn't just cost games, It cost continuity, belief, and years of progress that had to be rebuilt from scratch. That's why this decision feels heavier than most. Choosing to stay patient with Shedeur Sanders, or at least keeping him central to the plan, signals a philosophical shift. It suggests the Browns are finally prioritizing long-term structure over short-term optics. And whether that gamble pays off or not, it sets the tone for everything that follows. If Sanders develops, the Browns look like a franchise that finally learned how to build instead of chase. A team that resisted pressure, trusted its evaluation, and allowed growth to happen naturally. That kind of success doesn't just fix a position, it rewrites a reputation. It changes how free agents view the organization. It changes how coaches approach the job. It changes how the league talks about Cleveland. But if it doesn't work, the fallout is just as significant. Because patience only earns trust if there's accountability attached to it. Miss on this decision and the Browns risk being labeled as cautious to a fault, afraid to act, slow to pivot. And in a league that rewards decisiveness, that perception can be just as damaging as recklessness. That's the tightrope ownership is walking. For Jimmy Haslam, this may be the most important football choice of his tenure, not because of who starts week 1, but because of what the organization commits to believing. Stability over splash, development over desperation, alignment over impulse. Those choices echo. They influence how long the next coach gets, how much patience the fan base is asked to have, how the locker room responds when adversity hits. Because once you commit to a direction, you don't just evaluate the quarterback, you evaluate everything through that lens. And that's why this moment feels different. The Browns aren't just choosing whether Shedeur Sanders can be the guy. They're choosing whether they're finally done being the team that panics first and figures it out later. The next 5 years won't be defined by one throw or one season. They'll be defined by whether Cleveland sticks to this plan or abandons it the moment doubt creeps back in. And that decision is already in motion. By now, it should be clear this story was never really about one announcement, one interview, or one off-season move. It's about behavior. Because when you strip away the headlines, the speculation, and the noise, the Cleveland Browns haven't acted like a franchise searching for a quarterback. They've acted like one trying to manage a future they believe is already taking shape. Quietly, carefully, and without the panic that has defined them for so long. No public declarations, no forced optimism, just alignment. Ownership hasn't rushed. The front office hasn't leaked desperation. The coaching search hasn't been framed around starting over. And respected voices around the team have stopped using the language of emergency. That combination doesn't happen by accident. It happens when an organization feels more settled than it lets on. That doesn't mean Shedeur Sanders is guaranteed anything. Development is never promised. Growth is never linear. And no one inside the building would claim the future is locked in. But what is clear is that Sanders has been positioned as part of the plan, not a placeholder to be discarded at the first opportunity. And that distinction changes everything. Because teams don't quietly structure their offseason, coaching philosophy, and roster construction around someone they don't believe deserves time. They don't ask head coaching candidates how they develop a player they intend to replace immediately. And they don't avoid dramatic resets unless they believe stability is finally within reach. For Jimmy Haslam, this moment represents something deeper than a football decision. It's a test of restraint, a test of whether the Browns can finally resist the urge to chase the next fix and instead commit to a process that requires patience, something this franchise has rarely been afforded. The irony is that the most important decisions often happen in silence. No press conference, no breaking banner, just a series of moves that only make sense once you step back and connect them. And once you do, the picture becomes hard to ignore. The Browns may not have announced their future quarterback, but they're behaving like they already know who he might be. And if that's true, then this offseason won't be remembered for what Cleveland said, but for what they chose not to do.